Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Validity and Integrated Arguments approach. My name is Micheline Chalhoub-Deville, and my colleague, co-author, co-presenter will introduce himself. I just wanted to say bonjour tout le monde, marhaba lalkil. Oh, for some people, it might be nighttime, but we are glad that you are here with us today. Barry?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good night, and good evening to the various people who've registered for this event. We're very sorry we can't be here live, but it's in the middle of the night for us, and we are not at our best in the middle of the night. But we hope to still give you something to think about and to talk about, hopefully, when we're all done with this presentation.
What you said before we started recording, you said that you're on one continent, I'm on one continent, and we're presenting on a third continent. So this is quite amazing what's happening here today.
Well, it is. It's certainly a first for me.
Yes, for me too.
Yes. So this is what we're talking about. We'll have a quick bit of background because this is all really based on one of the chapters, but all of the thinking that goes into our latest book, which has just come out, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We then think a little bit about validity, and Micheline will go back over some of the well-known literature, but placing it now in a slightly different view. I think Micheline would agree that we're now beginning to think about things in a slightly different way, and that's where our integrated arguments approach comes from. We'll present our position, and we'll look at what we see as the biggest difference between what we're doing and what other people are talking about. And that is the focus that we have on the stakeholder, which we see as critical to the whole process of validation. And then we'll think a little bit about implications and conclusions, and hopefully we'll get all of that done in the time allotted. Some background first. Well, this is all based on a book, Chalhoub-Deville and O'Sullivan, Validity, Theoretical Development and Integrated Arguments, from Equinox Publishing. There you see the cover. It makes a wonderful piece of reading. I hope you will all go and buy it for Christmas. And
I have to say, sorry to interrupt, but I have to say that Barry posted this on Facebook and he said, make sure you buy a copy for Christmas. It makes for a thriller reading that evening.
A very exciting finish to it, a whodunit.
Yes.
But no, in all seriousness, this was a book that we said we'd talk about the background, and the background is really interesting because we had this idea at a conference about, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We talked about it first, and then we eventually got our act together and started working on it. And we probably spent the first year arguing and disagreeing with each other and wondering, how the hell are we ever going to write a book about this? Because we can't agree. But I think,
in a sense, Barry, what we were, before we even started to talk about the content of the book, the reason we came together is because we disagreed. And what we realized in our disagreements is that this is not a difference of opinion, you and me. It was a difference in tradition. We come from very different traditions. And even though we meet at conferences and we talk, we've never really had this face-to-face comparative analysis of the traditions. Bernard Spolsky talked about it back in the mid-90s, but hardly ever has there been a focus on validity like you and I have been doing, trying to compare where we come from and the traditions that we bring into the conversation.
Exactly, and I think bringing the strengths of both traditions, because we know that these traditions have been coming together for quite some time, and probably for 30 years they've been edging closer and closer, but often on a practical level the tests are beginning to look like each other, but in the theoretical level the theories haven't really kept up with each other. So what we've been trying to do is to somehow bring all of these different parts of the global view of validity together into a cohesive argument, for want of a better word, so that we can get people talking about it. We don't see this as the end of any road. We see it as, we hope, the beginning of a very interesting road that will take us into interesting places.
I would say, Barry, even today, we may have edged closer. Probably this is the closest we've ever been in terms of our thinking and operations. Given our conversations, I would say in the UK, you still operate with very different sensibilities about what is quality assurance, what is validity, compared to the way we do it in the US. So
Yeah,
we're coming together, but we still have big divide. And that's why I think this presentation and the book is very important.
yeah, I agree. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Micheline, to talk us through some validity stuff.
So obviously, I come from the US. I did my graduate training here in the US, and I've worked all of my life as an academician in the US. I've published on validity, and I teach a course, actually, a graduate course for master's and PhD students on validity. So I represent a certain tradition, as we've been saying. And I would say, regardless of the tradition, when we talk Messick, that is universal. And at one point, I joked and said, there is the MMQ quote, which is the mandatory Messick quote in every presentation you see. And so what you see here on the screen is something we're all very familiar with. And so this is just as a reminder. So when we talk about validity a la Messick, we're saying it is an evaluative judgment. And the minute you say it's a judgment, an evaluative judgment, that invokes stakeholders. Somebody is making that judgment. And that somebody is implicit here. We don't know who that is, but yet we need to make it explicit. And that's what Barry was saying earlier about our, if you will, significant contribution is to externalize and make explicit the focus on the stakeholder group. Another thing that jumps out in this definition is the focus on the evidence and the theory. Those have to come together in order to provide support for not the test, but the inferences and actions, the interpretations and uses we make of the scores. And embedded in this definition also are what Messick considers to be the criteria for evaluating this evidence and theory brought to support score interpretation and use. And he talks about adequacy and appropriateness of evidence and theory brought forward. Can you hear me okay, Barry, still?
Yes, everything is good.
So when Messick talked about the evaluative judgment, he anchored everything in construct validity. And this is the infamous progressive matrix. And if you look here, the first cell that focuses on test interpretation and the evidence or evidential basis, it is construct validity. And construct validity is an umbrella term he has here. It embodies all sorts of evidence, from content to response processes and so on. And so this is quite a loaded term, and that's problematic for many people. And on L-test-L for years, there was this ongoing debate. Well, what does exactly that mean in terms of operations? Where do we start with the validity? How do we proceed? Where do we end? When is it done? And so these are some of the concerns that were raised about this progressive matrix and Messick's approach to validity. Next slide. Sometimes the mouse works, sometimes it doesn't. Thank you. So Kane certainly was one of the voices that spoke to how Messick's approach is considered elegant at a conceptual level, but certainly not practical in terms of offering guidance to operations. And so Kane reformulated the validity thinking a la Messick into a more, what he calls practical operational approach that he calls validation. And he says validation is an overall plan, again, to evaluate, which invokes somebody is doing the evaluation. the interpretations and uses of test scores as proposed in the interpretive argument. And so that's his new contribution. He talks, instead of a progressive matrix, he proposes an interpretive argument, which looks like, next slide. Okay, I guess before I talk about the interpretive argument, I need to mention that the chapters where Messick and Kane published their thinking, those appear in a publication called the Educational Measurement. It's a handbook that appears every 10 years or so. And one could argue that thinking in those chapters represents cutting edge thinking in the field. They're intended to push the argument forward. Another publication that is seminal in the field is the standards. It's the standards for educational and psychological testing. And those are published every, again, 10 to 15 years. So now we're operating with the 2014 publication. And the content of the standards, when in terms of validity, for example, would be considered the status quo, where things stand in the field in terms of our consensus on what validity is. So Messick and Kane, their publications represent cutting edge, pushing the field forward, and the standards represent where we are right now, and we tend to relatively agree on how it is defined in the standards. So let me see if my mouse would allow me to move next. Thanks, Barry. So the standards, and what we tend to agree to generally, is they define validity not in terms of construct validity. In 1999, as the quote shows you, they did talk about validity a la Messick in terms of construct validity. There is no mention of construct validity per se as an umbrella term in the 2014, but they still talk about validity the same way that Messick and Kane are talking about it. Validity is not about the test. We do not say a test is valid. We talk about validity in terms of the appropriateness of the interpretations of the scores for a particular use. So the definition you see here from page 11 talks about validity not as all or nothing. It is a degree to which, again, evidence and theory support the interpretations of scores for proposed uses. And they talk about accumulating this, if you will, evidence and theory. And they talk about 5 sources specifically of evidence to support the validity argument. Evidence based on content, test content, response processes, internal structure, which is where you do dimensionality studies, factor analysis, and such. Relations to other variables, this could be called the criterion-related evidence, and then evidence for validity and consequences of testing. I will not get into this today, but just notice how for the other 4, it's evidence based on, but for the consequences, it's evidence for validity, and then you add consequences of testing. You can read a lot more about this in detail in our book if you're interested, but for the sake of the argument, we will keep moving here. So going back to Kane and his chain of inferences that he calls the interpretive argument. So for Messick, he had the progressive matrix. For Kane, it's the interpretive argument that is the agenda for validation. If you, Barry. So in the interpretive argument, Kane's approach says you first lay out the claims, the hypotheses, the assumptions that you have that pertain to your assessment, and then you engage in what he calls the validity argument that basically covers the research that you undertake in order to examine and support or find out where the weaknesses are in terms of your claims and assumptions and hypotheses. And it's important to note that he doesn't view his approach with the Toolman framework as the only way to do it, but he very much emphasizes the importance of laying out the claims and then proceeding with the research. So that's what he emphasizes. Next slide.
Yeah, but just before you go on with that, even the Toolman approach itself is interpreted in different ways. There's the basic 3-element Toolman, and then there's a 6-element Toolman. So Toolman itself is again not a cookbook. It's an approach that's quite flexible, and it can be presented in a number of different ways. And for me, one of the great strengths of Kane is that we can take a very American approach or a very UK approach and plug it into the IA system, and it seems to work quite well. So it's quite flexible like that.
Nice addition, Barry. Next slide, please. Oh, I talked about this. Next one. So this is the interpretive argument, and I don't know if you see my mouse moving. Do you, Barry?
I can't.
You cannot.
I can maybe my mouse I can use.
Okay, so if you point to where the interpretive argument starts, oops. Technology. This is the first time we're doing this together, and so there are kinks in the system that we'll figure out at some point. So the interpretive argument is a chain of inferences, and the first chain or bridge is the scoring bridge. And then from that scoring bridge, which allows you to connect some students' observations, we collect their performances on tasks or items, but then we have to convert those into scores. So that scoring is a very key inference, or there are assumptions or operations that are embedded in that scoring that need to be examined and supported so that we have some relative confidence in the operations and in the observed scores that are produced from the scoring. The next set of inference or bridge is the generalization, which allows us to move from the scores that we have produced to generalizing beyond the specific tasks that appeared on the test. So if you will, there is an implicit arrow between that cell or box, a universe score that goes to the universe of generalization in the big bubble. So he's trying to connect the right side back to the left side. And I can keep going on. The next inference is the extrapolation that allows you to move into the larger domain, if you will. And then the implication allows you to start putting value judgments on those scores: pass, fail, good reader, average reader, excellent writer, below proficient writer, and so on. So these are the basic inferences that Kane talked about in 2006. And then he added to that interpretive argument in 2013 uses. And so the argument became known as not IA, but IUA. And the other slides will show you that as well. Next, please. So if you look at this, this is what I was talking about. You can read it later on. And if you have questions, Barry and I would be happy to answer them. So the decision inference is new. The theory inference is something that was added later on. And I guess that's enough for now. Next. So in this slide, what I tried to do is to superimpose the standard sources of evidence onto Kane's interpretive use argument. And the sources of evidence are in greenish. And you see, and you may say, well, that's not exactly where I would have put them. The point here is to show you that there is a strong relationship association between the standards and Kane's thinking. What the Kane's approach offers that the standards do not offer is a way to sequence the inferences. So for the standards, they just are categories and you have no idea what to engage in first and so on, and how to proceed. Whereas with Kane, he has a particular sequence. Now you can also change the order of inferences as Chappelle et al. Had done when validating the TOEFL IBT when it was first being designed and developed. But this is, I guess, the standard way in which he has proposed these inferences. Another, I guess, issue to pay attention to here is, and again, Chappelle in 2011 critiqued Kane's approach by saying this focuses on the measurement side. And certainly Bennett had relabeled the interpretive argument as the measurement argument and said, this is what a psychometrician works on. As language testing, we pay professionals, we pay a great deal of attention to the construct and to test development, which represents the left side of the screen. So Kane leaves this more or less unattended to. Next slide, please. So in language testing, we have Bachman and Palmer who said exactly that. You leave test development out of the validity equation, and that is wrong. Evidence for validity doesn't commence at the observation and scoring level, it begins at the design level. So they presented an approach they called the assessment use argument, in which they include test development, assessment development as a strong component of validity. And then the, if you will, the measurement argument is on the right side of this figure. So I think I like assessment use argument because it provides a more representative picture of how actually quality assurance is developed and the way we actually do and should work with validity. The other thing I like about it is they anchor their work in consequences. We don't undertake the development of tests just to interpret scores. It is to interpret them and use them to achieve a particular end. And these outcomes or ends are in a sense consequences. So it is realistic to anchor things in consequences like Bachman and Palmer have done. And others have talked about this approach as theory of action, and we will be talking about that later. So there is an assessment argument here, and then there is the, if you will, measurement argument and consequences. Now, Bachman and Palmer talk about stakeholder groups not as part of the model per se, but part of the text. So they don't ignore that. But I think given how important, especially in areas like accountability testing, educational reform, it's important to externalize the stakeholder groups and make them part of the argument that we are building, and to differentiate the arguments in terms of who we are talking to, the stakeholder groups. Next. So consequences, as I said earlier, in the standards, they just have a different role that they play towards validity. And that's because not everybody agrees that we should include consequences in validity. Everybody says consequences are important. Where they disagree is on what role they should play in contributing to the validity argument. And at the heart of that, if you will, contention is who's responsible for collecting the evidence, the test developer or the test user. And so these entail resources, financial, expertise, as well as legal. If there are consequences that are negative and unintended, who is to be held responsible for that? So this is part of the reason why consequences are controversial. Next, please. So if we are to engage in consequences, I would like to draw your attention to that last question we have there. We don't have necessarily the training to engage in that type of research ourselves. We need to re-educate ourselves and potentially partner with other disciplines that investigate consequences, learn from them, partner with them in order to engage in this endeavor meaningfully. But this is the future, and we're calling attention to that. Next. So this beautifully messy picture is basically what I shared with you earlier. It is the interpretive use argument by Kane, with the yellow pieces, if you will, are the sources of evidence from the standards. And I have added in red the theory of action as, or consequences that should drive the whole endeavor. That's why they are on top. And then on the left, you have the development argument, which resembles the left side of Bachman's work. And also Mislevi, we'll talk about Mislevi later on, has spent his entire career elaborating the development argument operations. And then on the right, if you will, is the measurement argument a la Kane, and pretty much the standards as well. And at the bottom, anchoring the whole operation is communication. I would say the three arguments are for naught if we don't get the communication plans right in order to share with individuals and groups what we're doing and to present them with an argument that sells them on the product and the services. Barry?
Okay, well, let's think a little bit now about where we come from with our approach. And a lot of our thinking, we knew we had something to talk about when Micheline talked about that very slide that we've just seen a number of years back. And I showed her a very similar slide, or well, in some ways similar slide. And we realized that a lot of our thinking around this concept of communication and the importance of stakeholders was very similar. We were putting it in different places, and we weren't really thinking about it in terms, in those days, of being so integrated into the whole validation argument itself. But we came up over the last number of years with a 4-point plan, if you like, where we look at it in terms of 4 areas: test development argument, which you've heard about already, measurement argument, but now a theory of action argument, where that becomes part of the whole process of validation. And finally, the communication argument. And we'll talk a little bit about those now over the next few minutes. So the point about all of these is that instead of our traditional validation arguments, which we have quite a lot of technical expertise in putting together, we have essentially failed, I believe, to think about how these can be pulled together in a way that's meaningful for people who are beyond our own circle. So essentially, a lot of the validation arguments that we put together over the last number of years or decades have been aimed at ourselves. And we've become extremely proficient at talking to ourselves. And what Micheline and myself realized a few years back was we actually need to be talking to other people. And we need to be talking to them in their language, not just in ours, because if we talk to them in ours, they'll just switch off.
And they don't understand what we're talking about. I mean, try explain standard error of measurement to somebody who hasn't taken a course.
Yes. No, yeah, and we say language assessment literacy, for example, we say this is what you need to know, instead of listening to other people and thinking, well, what do we need to know about their context that will make our understanding of their needs more realistic? So it doesn't always work. So if we think about development models, we've just taken a couple. There are plenty. There's quite a good one in Bachman and Palmer 2006, I think, as well. That's extremely complex. We've just taken a couple of approaches from both sides of the Atlantic that some people would say they're quite different. I would say they're almost exactly the same. There's very little difference between them. There's a little bit more detail in some areas in the social cognitive approach on the right-hand side of the screen, whereas there's a lot more detail on the whole process on the left-hand side in Miss Levy's. So we could work on the one to make it a bit more like the other and vice versa. But the reality is that we are very much singing from the same hymn sheet. And conversations with Bob Miss Levy over the last year have really brought it home to me on how similar our thinking is. Though at the bottom, there is a difference, and it's a significant difference that Micheline has just been talking about. And that is that essentially the US approach, in my opinion, is very measurement driven. And the UK approach does not tend to be as measurement driven. So there are different emphasis of the kind of evidence, and the expectations of how that evidence is analyzed and used is different. It's just that we come from different parts of the universe in some ways. But what we have to realize is that both are important. And I think that's where we're going with all of this. Both of these things are important. So when we're developing a test, right from the beginning, we need to start thinking of how am I going to validate this test? And right from that same day, we need to think, what development model will I be using? Now, obviously, I'm biased because I'm going to go for a socio-cognitive approach. But if I was forced to use a Miss Levy's evidence-based design approach, I would equally happily use it, to be absolutely honest, because they both give me a starting point as a practical developer. And the problem with a lot of other models is that they don't actually give you that practical starting point. But we do need one. That's the whole point. We also need more than that. So on the left-hand side, we have Khalifa and Weir's reading progression model, which I've always found fantastically useful because, again, it can be interpreted in a way that will allow us to build a real test. In fact, it was used on the bit on the right, which is the Aptus studies that we did put together when we were building that test. The point being that part of the validation process isn't just having a theoretical model and a theoretical understanding as far as we are concerned, but it's also understanding the language theories. Where's the language in my language test? It's a critical question that we have to ask of tests. And then where's the documentation? Show me what you've done. So for me, part of the whole validation process is documenting how you built the test. It forms a critical element of what we're at. Another part on the measurement argument, and Micheline has talked quite a lot about the measurement side of things, but it's equally important for test developers to be upfront and to talk about how different aspects of their validity evidence that relate to measurement came into being. They didn't just appear. And they should be based on strong theories and on strong practice. So I just put a couple of reports up there from ROFL, as I say, apologies, that should be TOEFL, obviously, and from IELTS. There was a bit of a Freudian slip there, I think.
Very. I'd like to point out that those interested in learning more about documentation to share with the public, the standards, certainly the 2014 edition has a chapter, and that's chapter 7. It talks about supporting documentation for tests. In the US, that is mandatory almost, that all tests need to provide the public with information about their operations. And so the standards talk about 4 clusters, from appropriate use to test development to administration and scoring to the delivery of test documents and so on. So the audience might be interested in checking out the standards 2014, chapter 7.
But we will say that those standards are generally aimed at professionals.
Yes, yes.
And that's where we are now taking the next step onto
I
number
mean,
3.
I thought you were going to say they're aimed at North Americans. That's what I thought you were going to say.
Sadly, yes, that is the fact. But they are fantastically useful standards to have, and anybody who develops tests needs to be aware of them. We're arguing, though, that we need to move beyond this idea of a theory of the measurement and the theoretical models of language and the test development models to start thinking more about what are we trying to achieve in our programs. So I've been doing some work on evaluation recently within the British Council, and we in our theory we argue that you start with an outcomes framework, very similar to AUA, where you say, this is what I want to achieve, this is what I'm trying to do with this test. You set that out as clearly as you possibly can, and then you build the argument. So very much what Kane is talking about, very much what Bachman and Palmer are talking about, clearly what we're talking about, because what we've done is we've taken that concept and brought it right into the validation argument. For us, it isn't something that you should consider doing, it's something that you must do as part of the argument. So if we're to think of the consequences of the test, then our theory of action allows us to engage with the stakeholders. And it allows us to engage with the stakeholders, we hope, in a way that's going to be meaningful to those stakeholders. Let's now focus on the stakeholders. Micheline, would you like to talk to this one? This is one of your favorites.
So let me say that this is something that I started to talk about within the context of educational reform, and it was an invitation that I had received to speak at the Association of Language Testers in Europe. And it was Mike Milanovic who said, I'd like you to speak on issues of educational reform, testing, social and educational impact. So that was the impetus for my thinking at the time. And then I continued to work with what is called the Global Educational Reform Movement, or GERM for short, which is about accountability testing intended to drive educational efforts around the world. And so within that context, you have to think about roles and responsibilities for undertaking the research in order to achieve political agendas. So usually the test developer sets everything about the test in terms of specifications and the score interpretations and so on. Well, largely they do. In educational testing, for accountability purposes, it is the policymaker that is dictating the whole operation, more or less. And so one could argue they are the test developer, and the test developer is simply more largely reacting and developing what the policymaker wants them to do. So in that context, it is difficult to understand or differentiate who is the test developer and who is the test user. The roles are very much conflated. And so in situations where we do not have clear distinctions of roles, then the responsibilities need to be negotiated. And so I will not get into this slide too much. There is an article that I published in Language Testing that elaborates this model. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is that zone of negotiated responsibility. That variable emphasizes the importance that test developers and users and policymakers, in a sense, need to get together and start delineating at the outset of the operation who's responsible for what, who has the resources to undertake the research, who is to be held responsible, what is shared responsibility, how do we communicate about these things. And certainly test developers might say, we are simply reacting to things, and so our responsibility should be limited. The issue of time, the variable of time, is there to indicate as the test becomes more entrenched. The more time happens and the test is operational, the test developer is reaping financial benefits from having the test in operation. And so they need to, even if they agree to less research at the beginning, they need to increase their scope of research over time to accommodate the fact that the test is in operation. And there are all sorts of unintended uses, interpretations that come into play. I'll stop at that and let's skip the next slide in the interest of time, Barry.
Yes. Yeah, we'll get on to the communication argument now. And the point that we're making here essentially is that there are various types of models of communication that we don't particularly use. We tend to have linear models where I tell you something, I give you some information about my test. Sometimes in the development stage, we may have interactional models where we'll gather feedback about that. But the concept of transactional, where we're actually discussing and debating and swapping ideas, isn't something that we have developed as part of validation arguments up to now. The reality is, of course, that most of these things happen in a hybrid fashion. The whole point of having these models of communication is that they're all going to, we cannot have a fixed approach because different contexts of use will be defined by different stakeholders with different intended and intended messages and outcomes. Therefore, the messages in the models of communication cannot be the same. We've got to build our model of communication, purpose build it, if you like, to match the expectations of that particular context. Now, I could have a whole load of questions here, but I'm not going to talk about them. We're running a little short on time, so we'll move along. But you can read all of those, about those in the book. Here are some of the questions that we suggest about stakeholders. But the critical thing to take away is that we cannot speak to all stakeholders in the same way, and we cannot use the same channels of communication either, because they're just not going to work necessarily. So when we think of the concept of principle design and impact by design, which are quite different things. One is designing our test with a set of principles in mind that we know this test is going to work within a specific context to allow us to make particular inferences. We want to have these particular inferences. We want to have a particular impact with what we do. That doesn't happen by chance. The concept that we're talking about is we've got to think about all of these things at all of the stages of the development and throughout our validation argument, because all of these contribute in some way towards that principle design. And also, and maybe in some cases, some aspects will be more prominent, but in other cases, when we come to impact by design, other things such as theory of action and communication probably will be more prominent in the argument. But if we're to achieve complete principled design and complete impact or positive impact, we have to think of all four levels at the same time and build those into our approach. The implications and approach then, this is the basic model that underpins the socio-cognitive approach. This was based on the first thinking that Cyril and myself had together 20 years ago. I then conceived of this all as being very much related to the context of use. And
you want me to take over? And so when we were looking at this, obviously, if you are familiar with Miss Levy's work, and you look and you see the test model, the scoring model, the test taker model, and so on, in evidence-centered design on my side of the Atlantic where I live, we talk about Miss Levy's layers, the conceptual assessment framework, for example, layer that includes things such as the test model, the student model, the assembly model, and so on. There's also the assessment implementation layer and the delivery layer. So we are not talking very different things in regard to the test development and the measurement model when it comes to context of use. The idea is you need to pay attention to the particulars in a given use in order to tailor the system and the services to accommodate the specifics of context.
Yes, and when we think then about that context of use, the people who are really the people who define that context of use. So when we want to think about consequences, we have to think about those people. And when we think about those people, that's where our theory of action model comes in, because any consequences are going to load onto the people or some of the people or all of the people within that chart. We'll also think of the communication model. How are we going to talk to them? How are we going to build our communications plan right from the beginning? And I'm conscious now that we've hit.
Barry, I just would like to say one thing. When we talked about AUA, it's important to note that Buckman and Palmer don't call their model a validation model. They call it a justification model. And
Yes.
That is something you see in the measurement field. Some argue that when we talk about consequences, when we talk about uses, that's not validity, that is justification. Barry and I believe that it would lead us astray to start talking about justification. We think that all of these operations are solidly within the scope of validation research.
Yes. So again, our time doesn't allow us to go through some of these questions, but I could give you a hint and tell you that if you go to the last chapter of the book, you'll find all of these questions. And so the next time I see any of you in public, I can have you a little test to see that you read them. We'll move on to a concluding quote, some quotes. This is actually from the last paragraph of the book. And basically what we're saying here is our theories have helped us to understand the area more and more thoroughly. But to some extent, and to some large extent, we've failed to adequately reflect the needs of key stakeholders. And what we're trying to do here is to redress that balance.
And as I said in my introduction, Bernard Spolsky in 1995 started to talk about the differences that exist, if you will, the European or the UK model and the US model. And so it was out of that tradition that Barry and I started to talk. And there hasn't been a book, not a single book as far as we're aware, that delves so deeply into these differing traditions. And Bernard Spolsky's 1995, plus he dedicated just a small part of his book, Measured Word, to the topic. So we feel that this book fills an important, a much needed space in our field. We hope that you will take a look at what we have and start to look at providing and undertaking comparative validation, theoretical and operational work across different regions so that we can bring richness into our conversations, given the particulars of our uses.
Okay, we'd like to say thank you very much. If you're interested in the book, the QR code there will help you to get to the website to find it. I'd like to say thank you very much for coming or staying at home and listening to our presentation. And I'd like to thank Micheline for all of the great work on the book that we've done. It's been a great learning exercise, and it's great to see it done and get some of the
absolutely ideas. The book just came out, and we are delighted that the fruit of our labor for years is right there to share with the field. Thank you, Barry, and everybody stay safe. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.